More and more Christians are becoming even more and more educated and knowledgeable with the Holy Bible. Yes, and what I propose much is because of our modern societies need higher levels of education for careers and with a need for higher paying jobs to support families and to live the good old-fashioned American dream, right? That's freedom, free enterprise, home, cars, kids, enough food, healthy food to put on the table for longevity, and so forth. And as Christians are learning that the only biblical Sabbaths are not on Sundays, even in the New Testament, but rather the only on the seventh day of each week. But, however, the biblical Sabbaths seem to be no longer important to our Creator, to Him, based upon the so-called lack of good evidence in the New Testament. Well, why isn't there more support in the New Testament? I've often heard, and many of you have heard as well, which leads to this video teaching title, and as I share my slide here, why are Sabbaths important? So I'm going to give my top 10 questions for Christians and others out there, and I'm not targeting those of sacred name believers who believe in using the sacred name, the Hebrew name of our Creator as found in the Scriptures, the Yud, He, Vav, He, Hebrew letters as pronounced in different ways. So just want to give you out there a little heads up on this, and if you listen through this, maybe you'll find some little nuggets to share with your fellow Christians and believers out there who are not keeping the biblical weekly Sabbaths. I'll use titles for His name in here. So, considering my audience here, I have top 10 questions. Number 1 is, if the weekly biblical Sabbaths, the timing and observance, not be important to Him, then why? Why would a non-physical God want or need to rest after 6 days of physical, I say physical matter, the universe as we know it, the three-dimensional world and universe? He did all these works, He did all this labor for 6 days, as we read in Genesis chapter 1, and then we continue in verse chapter 2. Why does He rest? A non-physical Creator. And this was to begin about 2,500 years before the Jewish people, before Israel ever existed, which is important to know. Another reminder, as we pick up in chapter 2 of Genesis, on the seventh day He ended His works which He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all His work which He had done. Verse 3 here, then He blessed the seventh day, made it a blessing, and He sanctified it. He sets it apart to be different from the other 6 days of each week. Because, notice how I bolded this word, because in it He rested from all His work which He had created and made. So, because He rested, this is why I propose He rested, to see as an example for humanity. Who loves Him? Who wants to follow His example? And you may have a different answer than that out there. If you do, please let me know. Why would a physical, non-physical, I should say, God want or need to rest? And a parallel question I ask is, why would our sinless, Spirit-filled from conception in the womb, our Messiah, want to be baptized? Did He need to? Or simply that He wanted to? Remember, Yochanan the Immerser, John the Baptist, as we also say, tried to reject His request and say, hey, you should be doing this to me, immersing me, not me, you. But We read that in Matthew chapter 3, that he wants this to be fulfilled for all righteousness. Of course, setting an example, knowing that those who love him say, whoa, if he did it, why wouldn't I want to? People who worship and have idols, American idols or Hollywood idols, they want to dress, they want to look, they want to copy whoever their idols are. And our Creator had this figured out at least 6,000 years ago, if not more. That's what I propose. So question number 2 of these top 10 questions is, repeating the question, if the weekly Sabbath, the timing and observance is not very important to him, then why have Moses tell the Israelites to observe the same seventh-day Sabbaths while they were still slaves in Egypt? Did you know that? As the first commandment, he restored to the Most High, his holy people. This is way before the Sinai covenant, before they're even freed. And for that matter, you see that on the road after they are freed. And they're on that road and they're traveling toward, not at Mount Sinai yet, in Exodus 16, the manna, the Sabbaths, again, are emphasized in importance before even getting to Mount Sinai, before those big 10 were spoken, and before they were written with his own finger, for that matter. So why? Well, let's visit the scripture on this in case you're unfamiliar with it. Exodus 5:5, right? Easy. We got the 2 tablets, 5 on one, 5 commandments, 5 words on each. You say the 10 words altogether, or 10 commandments. Different ways to say it. But notice this, picking up in verse 4, then the king of Egypt said to them, Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people from their work? Now, this doesn't sound like a union break, or hey, you're working too hard, let's take a siesta here, or some kind of a break that mankind usually does. But notice the wording here. And then the king says, get back to your labor. What we see is they're taking a day off. Not just one, but one each week. When you look at verse 5, and Pharaoh said, look, the people of the land are many now, and you make them rest. There's that three-letter Hebrew word, the shin, the bet, and the tav, is Shabbat, from their labor. Now, everywhere you see these 3 Hebrew letters, it's in reference to the weekly Sabbath. And I don't think I've done a teaching yet. There's actually 6 Hebrew words in the Tanakh that are translated as rest. And I'm only going to go to 2 of them, counting this one here. Nuach is the other one I'll go to in this teaching, but there's 4 others that I'll do another teaching on if I haven't done already. But this is important to realize. And as I was surprised last year watching the 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston. Remember those that were made back in, was it, the 50s or 60s of the 20th century? And the secular Jews in Israel, in Hollywood, doing the 10 Commandments, and whoever was behind it, not just Jewish people, but Charlton Heston, and the Pharaoh says to him, as playing the part of Moses, he says, why do you make the people keep the Sabbath? I'm going to take away their straw. And even they knew it was referring to the Sabbath. They knew the Hebrew, but why doesn't Judaism translate it as Sabbath? And why doesn't Christianity, for that matter? Those are good questions also. Generally, the Christians don't want to keep the Sabbath, so naturally Christian translations are going to put the word rest in there, and the Jewish people get a little jealous or upset when they see Christians or believe other people that are not Jewish keeping the weekly Sabbaths, generally speaking, and from in my experience and what I've seen, that it can, they don't want the Christians to do it. They feel it's their Sabbath, and both religions feel it's only for the Jewish people. But when we look at this Hebrew wording here, it's not giving the evidence that most translations give it by just putting rest in here. Notice how we see the same word used as 23, just after mentioning the land rests. In verse 12, it says, 6 days you shall do your work, and on the 7th day you shall rest. That's the shin, bet, and the tav. And you'll see the Hebrew Strong's Concordance is either 7676, this is 7673 in both of these verses that I mentioned, because they put some different vowels in there, but we have to remember the vowels were not there in the original Hebrew scriptures, definitely 2,000 plus years ago. So these are commentaries that kind of slightly change the Hebrew vowels based upon what they've learned. But we got to remember, this is the shin, the bet, and the tav. You shall Shabbat, that your ox and your donkey may rest. This is the nuach, the nun, the vav, and the chet. Here's Strong's number 5117, completely different Strong's number and Hebrew letters. Interesting. Animals, why aren't they told for Shabbat? That's a little midrash. Might be a little ambiguous, but my conclusion on that is that the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbaths were made for mankind, for humanity. And, of course, animals that are under the authority, the umbrella of human beings as pets and as work horses and mules and animals are to rest as well. But the Sabbath, Shabbat, is mostly made for mankind. And you go out in nature, you'll see wild animals are not keeping Shabbat. And they're fighting for survival. They're working 7 days a week, pretty much the same way, looking for food or mates or reproduction, and they're living their regular lives. But only when they are under the rule of humans as pets or work animals that they are to rest from their typical works. And of course, if you need to work to gather, to keep the holy assemblies as commanded in the scriptures, well, then animals can work as well as humans. The Levites worked harder on the Sabbaths, referring to the sacrificial systems and what they had to do and teach the people, the holy people, on the Sabbaths. There was more work and ministries when they have their gatherings. They're working harder on those days than the other days of the week, generally speaking. So we can see that working on the Sabbath for ministry purpose, priesthood works, is okay, and also rescuing and saving lives. We see that in the Torah as well as in the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah writings. So moving on to top 10 questions. Number 3 here, why out of all the 10, only one of them he says remember? The other 9 he doesn't say remember. Why is that? That's an important question. Remember, as it says in Exodus 20, verse 8, going through the 10 commandments, he gets to the 4th one. He says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, to keep it set apart. Could it be that this is the only commandment of those big 10 that humanity would want to stop or forget about, on how to observe it properly, for that matter? You try to pick it up and start observing it again after not doing it and not really looking to the scriptures or understanding the intent of the scriptures. Well, it's easy to get too strict with it or too liberal, one side of the ditch or the other, without the right balance. But based upon the inspired holy oracles, you see the holy scriptures, the writings, the written Torah. So I think our Creator could see this a long time ago. Not just the Jewish people, but any of His holy people down the road would want to stop doing it. So He's saying, remember. It's the only one of the 10. Christianity, most of them agree with all 9 based upon their understanding of those 9. But for some reason they say that 4th one doesn't apply to them. But it's the only one He says to remember. Important question there, I believe. And number 4 of my top 10 questions is if the biblical Sabbath timing and observance is no longer important within, say, the New Covenant. They say, well, maybe in the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, it was important, but not so much. We don't see much importance in the New. Well, why prophesy them for a new heavens and a new earth long after, for that matter, the inauguration of the New Covenant? As we see in Isaiah 66:22 and 23, it says, for as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, says that holy name, the Lord, Yud-He Vav-He, so shall your descendants and your name remain. So we still see the name of Israel. The Jewish people have not been extinguished or terminated completely, even though there's been many attempts over the centuries. They are still remaining, the descendants of Israel, and their name, their identity. Verse 23, and it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another. We see his calendar, the new moons, when the months begin. Also, the weekly Sabbaths. He says, all flesh. I think all the translations have this one right. All humanity. It doesn't say just all Israel or all the Jewish people, but all flesh shall come worship before him. Right? If it could be every day of the week or any day of the week we wanted, why is it saying that it's still important to come before him on the Sabbath, from one Sabbath to another? Question number 5 of the top 10 here. If timing and the observance is no longer important, why highly esteem foreigners, Gentiles, who do not profane the same Sabbaths as Israel? We see this in the prophet Isaiah 56, verse 6. And I'll quote that here for you. It says, also the sons of the foreigner. Foreigners are people outside Israel that are not Israelites, not Jewish people, who join themselves to the Lord to serve him and to love the name, to love his holy name and to be his servants. It says everyone, again, not just Israel or the Jewish people, but everyone who keeps from defiling the Sabbath and holds fast to my covenant. Now this would apply to any covenant, not just one covenant. Remember in Ephesians chapter 2, I think it's in verse 11 and 12, it says, and you Gentiles were once foreigners of the covenants of promise. Covenants plural. There's a lot of covenants to consider here. The Davidic covenant, the Noah covenant, the Abrahamic covenant. These covenants bring promises not to give you eternal life. If you understand these covenants, they were promises of blessings for human life, and human covenants with our Creator and human beings, and some of them were unconditional and called olam, forever. Not to go off on a tangent, but just to continue on with here, going to question number 6 here. If the timing and observance is no longer important to our Maker, then why did Nehemiah warn Israel that continuing to profane the Sabbath would cause them to lose the second temple as they did the first temple? Of course, there's other sins involved. I'm not saying there weren't other, like idolatry, and also worse disasters than just losing the physical temple, of course. But notice what he says here. Let's look at this carefully. Nehemiah 13, verses 17 and 18. It says, then I contended, Nehemiah speaking, I contended with the nobles of Judah. Right, the 10 tribes up north were already taken into captivity and lost their identity, the lost tribes. But here's Judah, the southern kingdom. He says to them, what evil thing? Okay, this is not a big deal to God anymore. He says, this is evil by which you profane the Sabbath day. This is evil in our Creator's eyes. Did not your fathers do thus? And did not our Yah, did not he bring all this disaster on us and this city? Right? He's there in Jerusalem. The temple's rebuilt, and they're getting things going again. He wants to do it right, not repeat mistakes that would cause him to lose the second one. He says, yet you bring added wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. So again, the question is, if the biblical Sabbaths, the timing and the observances, is no longer important, or very important to him at all in the first place, why would he change? Does he change? We'll consider that a little bit later here in this teaching. But let's move on to question number 7 I have here, about the timing and observance. If it's no longer important to him, how about post-resurrection? They say, okay, it's been all done at the cross. It was done after that resurrection, and the death, burial, and resurrection is done now. He fulfilled it, so we don't have to. Well, why did our Messiah command us to pray for our end-time flight. Exodus, as we may also word, that is, to not be on a Sabbath day. Now, some people say he's only talking about the Jewish people or before the temple was destroyed in 70 CE. Well, that temple was destroyed about 40 years after he was resurrected, after the death, burial, and resurrection. Right? So let's consider this in Matthew chapter 24. We call it the Olivet prophecy. They're on the Mount of Olives. And this is where he'll return with his second advent. We may use that terminology, his return. It says, and pray that your flight be not in the winter or on the Sabbath. And so some intelligent theologians will say, well, yeah, he was writing to the culture of the time and the people of the time. What are we going to say about that? With the whole book of Matthew? It was just written for the Jewish people? Or why cherry pick? Why not have it all written for all of us? It's all inspired for doctrine and for reproof for everybody, not just that generation. Notice, getting back to verse 3 here, let's look at the context. Now he sat on the Mount of Olives, and his disciples, his Talmudim, came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? Because they knew he's prophesied he's going to die, he's going to come back again, he's got to go and bring another helper. He says, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming? Okay, when are you coming back? And the end of this age. Again, they're asking for prophecies of long after his death. All done at the cross? No. He fulfilled it so we can too, not so that we don't have to, is what I propose here. And Yeshua, remember, we have to remember, it says in Hebrews 13:8, he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So we should not come to this conclusion that it was done at the cross. That's a teaching and a doctrine that has been misused and abused and wrongly taught by too many fellow believers of the Messiah. Now, getting to number 8 of these top 10 questions here regarding the timing and observance, the importance to our Creator and post-resurrections. And I'm going chronologically, if you haven't noticed, through the whole Bible here with these 10 questions. Why in the book of Acts the Gentiles are still observing biblical Sabbaths, not switching to Sundays? Even shortly before the Jerusalem 15 conference, within about 1.5 chapters before, for that matter, in chapter 13, getting way to the end, near the end of it, in verses 42 through 43, and I'll touch on 44 as well here. But notice this: so when the Jews went out of the synagogue, this is on a weekly Sabbath, you can look at the context yourself, the Gentiles begged. Some of these more modern liberal translations will say the people, because they don't want you to know this is Gentiles. They kind of want you to think that it's the Jewish people or a mixture of something like that. But he says the Gentiles begged that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. King James, I believe, is a little more accurate based upon the Greek manuscripts on this interpretation. Verse 43, now when the congregation had broken up, many of the Jews and devout proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who were speaking to them, persuading them to continue in the grace of Yah. So we see, it is a combination of Jews and the proselytes, were those who were proselyting. But notice this, verse 44, and on the next Sabbath, they didn't come back the next day. They didn't say, hey, can you come back tomorrow on Sunday? Can you come back on any other days of the week? They were all working these 6 days a week to provide. They all needed to provide for their daily needs. It was a work much like today. Everybody's busy. And so the timeouts that our Creator says to do, okay, let's get together. The next time out is next Sabbath. And the whole town, it says almost the whole city, came together to hear the word of the Most High. So, if it's no longer important post-resurrection, why are we seeing them still doing it? And I don't see evidence throughout the book of Acts where they switched to Sunday or they prioritize Sunday. Now, it's not wrong to get together on any day of the week and have Bible studies and to give offerings and to break bread. You can do that on any day of the week, just like Judaism today, even 2,000 years later. You can do a lot of these things and have your studies and worship on any day of the week. Of course, it's not wrong, but not to negate or abolish or do away or to stop keeping the weekly commanded ones. Not trading them out. We don't see that anywhere in the New Testament. And so the question is it still important to our Creator, the Most High? Well, let's look at number 9 question I have, in case those first 8 aren't good enough. Well, let's look to why would both our Messiah, our Savior, and Paul, a.k.a. Shaul, go to Sabbath worship congregations? The Greek word for sacred assemblies, ecclesias, the buildings of those worship would be synagogues, of course, but they're doing it every Sabbath, going to these buildings of worship. But not, most Christian ministries today. They don't want to follow Paul as he followed the Messiah. Right? So let's look at 3 connecting scriptures here to make this question so very important to consider. Luke 4:16, just to establish as one of them that our Messiah did this every Sabbath. As it says, as he came from Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue, into the building of worship on the Sabbath day and stood up and read. Now going to Acts 18:4, it says, and he, referring to Paul in context, Shaul, reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews, not just Jews, and then he would go on Sunday with the Greeks or the Gentiles, but every Sabbath the Gentiles would meet as well. And so when you go through the book of Acts and the New Testament, you see the Gentiles were converting to all the 10 commandments and other commandments for that matter. But don't want to go off on a tangent, but the third connecting verse here is where Shaul said, imitate me. That means copy me, right? Copy me just as I also copied the Messiah. I followed his example. I copied him, imitated him. And as people imitate their idols, as I said, their gods, their deities, they want to be more like them. They want to follow the examples. If they're American idols, Hollywood idols, well, they'll want to look and dress, or hairstyles, hairdos, whatever actions. They get influenced by the examples that are set by their idols, by their deities. And so why wouldn't we want to follow our Messiah and Shaul and the examples they set? Why don't we see Christian ministries following that example and prioritizing Sundays? That's an important question. Number 9, they're involved with those verses and others. Now here's number 10. Not that any of these are more important. I'm not doing a countdown of 10. Like you see the top 10 sports moves and plays on the media there. But here I'm just listing 10 chronologically through the scriptures from Genesis through the New Testament as well. If the biblical Sabbath timing observance was no longer important to our Creator or for Gentiles for that matter, then why would Paul, Shaul, write to the Colossians and state that only the substance of Messiah is to judge us regarding Sabbath obedience? Now, most of Christianity over the past few centuries, past 5 centuries at least, has been taking the wrong interpretation of this. It's not unified with the rest of the scriptures. But let's look at it with perfect unity of the Bible. He says, let no one judge you in food or drink. All right, Colossae, he's writing to a place outside of Israel, non-Jewish people, and they're starting to not drink blood, as the Torah says, not get drunk, as the Torah says, and eating foods according to the dietary food laws of Torah. When you start doing that and keeping the festivals and the new moons, the proper calendar system, and the weekly Sabbaths, he says these are all shadow. They're all symbolic of things to come. They're not the real thing, but the greater things are to come. But notice how he says here in verse 17, but the substance is of Messiah. Now take out that word is, because that's not in the original Greek manuscripts, the English conjunction words. But if we look at this without verse numbers, as it wasn't in the original manuscripts, it says, let no one judge you in these things but the substance of the Messiah. He's the only one, not human beings. Don't let human beings or ministries or religions judge you in these things. But our Messiah, because we're all going to stand before him. Jumping into not the context, but notice Romans 14:10, it says, for we shall all stand before the judgment seat of him. He is to judge us on these things. And in the example he set for us, right? Also, quoting him in Luke 21:36, watch therefore and pray always that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass, and to stand. Again, we're going to have to stand before him, the Son of Man, as even Daniel said, the Son of Man is coming in the clouds, referring to being the king of all the earth, fulfilling the kingship role of the Messiah, not the Ancient of Days. Nevertheless, getting back to this number 10 here, this is an important question to answer regarding the proper interpretation of what Paul's saying here in Colossians chapter 2, to create perfect unity with the Scriptures, not serious contradictions within the Scriptures. So how will he judge us without partiality, I might add? And there's about a half a dozen Scriptures that show that he does not show partiality. He wants everybody to be one, but he doesn't want partiality among anyone. And the way he judges us will not be with partiality. We all have our time of calling. When that time is due, we have to respond to it. But let's remember, he says in Malachi, he says, for I am, there's that holy name again, translated as Lord, I do not change. Now, he can change administrations and change methodology of this and that, the Levitical priesthood, Melchizedek priesthood, but his character doesn't change. His commandments that of actions do not change. And he wants us to follow his ways. We can count on him not saying, hey, this is bad, now it's good, and go back and forth and be wishy-washy and toss to and fro. Again, remembering Hebrews 13:8, that Yeshua, or the Messiah, is the same yesterday, today, and forever. If you think that he's changed, well, there's got to be concrete, explicit evidence in the Scriptures, not ambiguous stuff that we want to conclude and change and cherry pick however we want. Notice it says here, as quoting him again, in Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 and 22, it says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom. If you're calling him Lord, well, that means you believe in him. I assume you do. And not putting on a show. He says, but those who do the will of my Father in heaven. The Father, going back to creation week, all these 10 points, the Sabbaths are important to him. Why wouldn't his Son think they're important if they're important to the Father? Father and Son businesses out there, right? They carry on the name and the reputation. The Son will for the Father. And even if improvements are made, he doesn't become a rebellious son. Well, that's another point I won't go off into. But verse 22, it says, many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, done many wonders in your name? Then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. That Greek word is anomios. And nomos is the Greek word for law, for Torah, for the writings of Moses. Usually translated as law, but it should be translated as Torah if you want to go to the Hebrew. Torahlessness, or Torahless people, people who are profaning the Torah as a practice. It's not like they're working on overcoming and changing, but they're just justifying. Right? Remember that scripture in Jeremiah? It says the heart is deceitful above all things. I think that's in verse 9. Going off my memory here, I'll insert the scripture with my video editing later on and before I post it onto YouTube. But he searches the heart. And what is it, verse 5 back there? He says, cursed is man who trusts in man. Don't put your trust in doctor's degrees, rabbi's degrees, all these great, highly intelligent educational systems of humanity. We tend to want to put our trust and confidence in them. And so our mind can get off track if our heart wants to justify things. But I think it's verse 10, continuing on in Jeremiah 9, he searches the heart of everybody. They say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You can have good intentions in your mind and think you're doing good, but it's got to be right in the heart and in the mind and in the body, which is our actions, our strength, our vitality, our health. Everything is to love him. And that's what the whole Torah is about, loving him, the two great commandments, loving him and loving our fellow human beings. The 10 commandments are broken up into that. So when you keep his Sabbaths on his original timing, you're loving him. And it helps you love others better as well. You're fulfilling both commandments when you fulfill his Torah. But there's intellectual arguments to veer people away from that. But again, let's remember, why reject part of the Gospels for Gentiles, including him saying, pray that your flight be not in the winter or on the Sabbath. He's going to judge you if you start cherry-picking and saying some of it's for the Jewish people and some of it's not. I don't have to follow some of his commandments that he gave in his teachings. Well, we have to remember, the carnal mind is enmity. This is the carnal mind is enmity against him, for it is not subject to the Torah. And the Greek word there is nomos, the Torah of him, and neither can it be. So again, Jeremiah will justify, will want to make things right, will lean upon our own understanding, and we'll do what's right in our own eyes with good intentions that we're worshiping him and honoring him with our lips and with our music, and we can honor him a lot, but are our hearts really far from him? Are we still too carnal? Even as theologians with doctor's degree in mega churches and much following after them, well, are you going to give more credibility to that than the simplicity of these 10 questions I have regarding the importance of the Sabbath to our Creator, to our Maker? So let's recap the title of this message. As I'm already started already, why are Sabbaths important? To him, but not to most Christians, even to this day. But according to prophecies, it'll change eventually, and some of us are forerunners. So let's please share these 10 questions. If you can come up with more, you can make comments on this video teaching, and give me some more from Scripture that are explicit, not just ambiguous, but explicit questions that if you want unity in the Scriptures and you want to find out why are they important, well, let's share those questions with love. As we say in Greek, the agape love is this love that our Creator has with humans, that he wants humans to have with other humans, that goes deeper than just sibling love. We say brotherly love or sibling love, philia love. In the Greek would be philia, philios, and different Greek grammar words for philia, brotherly love. We have the city of Philadelphia here in the United States, and the city of brotherly love, we can say. But it's got to go deeper than just words and lip service. To share these top 10 questions for intelligent and sincere Christians, to show the importance of the Sabbath in his eyes, in his opinion, why they're important to him.